Ed Gein was one of the most twisted serial killers of the 20th century and the alleged inspiration for Silence of the Lambs. He used to make masks, lampshades, belts, and vests made from the skin of his victims. What you may not be aware of is the fact that people in the 19th century created clothes from human skins more often than we are comfortable admitting. Unlike Gein's spree, no one was murdered, but if poor people died and remained unidentified, their skin could be used to create clothes. One of the most common objects to be covered in human skin were books. A Dr. Ludovic Boland was apparently the man who covered a book recently found at Harvard University. He received the book as a gift in 1880 and covered it in skin, a process also known as anthropodermic bibliophagy. In the UK, there is a book in the Bristol Record Office made from the skin of a man who was hanged in the local jail. The tale becomes even more macabre when you continue analyzing the case. The book contains the details of the crime committed by John Horwood, an 18-year-old man convicted of the murder of Eliza Balsam in 1821. He apparently stalked the young lady after becoming infatuated with her, and one day, he beat her to death with a large rock. Surgeon Richard Smith dissected Horwood's corpse and used his skin to cover a collection of notes on the case. Over in Australia in the 1880s, a New South Wales doctor used to make his shoes from skin, but with a caveat: the skin had to come from an African because he believed their skin made the best leather. Although he wasn't from the United States, the physician fought in the U.S. Civil War on the Union side. He claimed that he would use a white man's skin if it were sufficiently thick. If you've ever tasted a bottle of beer that tasted like stale piss, just know that you would be deemed lucky in certain places in the 19th century. We know that strychnine is fatal in anything above a minute dose, but in the 1800s, people were rolling the dice without even realizing it. Strychnine was considered a tonic and beer companies added it to their products for a little extra kick. Predictably, things went horribly wrong on more than one occasion. You were at greatest risk if you lived in Australia by the looks of things. Two men walked into a bar in Victoria, asked for ale and proceeded to drink it. However, it was far too bitter to consume, so they stopped, just in time as it happened because the beer contained too much strychnine. Had they gulped their drink down in one, death was certain. In the same year, Thomas Lester was not so fortunate as he died from the effects of drinking beer with excessive strychnine. A fellow crewman by the name of Walter White also fell seriously ill but survived. Lester died within an hour of consuming the beer, and his death was a ghastly sight. Both men suffered violent spasms after their ship arrived at the Queenscliff Pier. A solicitor at the scene advised giving the men water and mustard, but to no avail. 12 years later in the state of Queensland, Catherine Waddell also suffered the death by beer fate. She panicked after drinking a small quantity of ale that tasted bitter and immediately became convinced she had been poisoned. Initially, the post-mortem concluded that Waddell had worried herself to death. Eventually, the police collected the offending bottle and found that it contained 24 times the lethal dose. Poor Waddell didn't stand a chance. Waste management was a constant problem during the 19th century. The age of industrialization helped invent many new things, but it also led to mass urbanization. Cities became overcrowded rapidly, and the powers that be had no idea what to do about the waste that was accumulating at warp speed. In cities like London during the Victorian era, gutters were filled with litter, and streets were covered in animal and human excrement. Human waste was also thrown directly into the sewers and ended up in nearby rivers. On at least one occasion, the Parliament in London had to stop working because the smell of waste was so overpowering. While legislation was brought in to try and combat the problem, the poor were left exposed to all manner of diseases. New York City had a unique problem in the 1880s, an excessive amount of horse manure that was clogging up the streets. At that time, there were anywhere up to 200,000 horses living in the city, and each one was capable of producing an average of 22 pounds of waste a day. One article from the New York Times in 1880 outlines the case of a large horse manure pile remaining uncollected on East 52nd Street for a year. The problem continued into the 20th century when it was alleged that 20,000 New Yorkers died from airborne diseases, typically generated by horse manure. The city also had a serious problem with animal carcasses. Approximately 15,000 dead horses were removed from the streets in 1880, and in some cases, these large carcasses were left to rot until they disintegrated. There were so many dead animal carcasses tossed in the Hudson River that they started to wash up on the shore and make residents ill. Even when the carcasses were dumped outside the city, the water would often bring them back in. Although the growth of factories meant that there was more employment available, demand always outstripped supply by a large margin. As a result, there were long lines of men, women, and children desperate for work. Unscrupulous employers realized that they had hit a goldmine. They could hire as many people as they liked, force them to work extremely long hours, and pay them a pittance. Despite working anywhere from 80 to 100 hours a week, unskilled laborers would be fortunate to receive $8 to $10. This worked out at around 10 cents an hour, and while skilled workers got more, they didn't receive a substantially higher wage. It was common for women to receive half a man's pay, and children earned even less. Some children worked such long hours in dusty, dark conditions that they developed physical deformities. Labor unions were ultimately formed to try and ensure workers, especially children, were no longer being exploited. It wasn't as if workers were well nourished either. The typical diet of a working-class person makes for grim reading. Breakfast consisted of plain bread with tea or coffee if they could afford it. Lunch might be a small piece of bread with some vegetables and ale on occasion. Dinner typically consisted of a thin vegetable broth, perhaps with a tiny portion of meat. In the UK, workers might have oatcake for breakfast and supper, with potato pie and bacon for dinner. Tea and butter were extremely rare delicacies. Overall, the standard diet was cheap carbohydrates and little protein. Wealth flowed amongst a tiny percentage of the American population during the Gilded Age of the 1880s and 1890s. However, practically nothing trickled down to the working class, as they were forced to graft, beg, and steal to get enough money to eat and afford rent. Those who had no employment had to panhandle to stay alive, and it was normal to go a couple of days without eating. While it is true that there are plenty of working-class people struggling today, it doesn't compare to the terrible standards of yesteryear. Crime was rampant in urban areas during the 19th century. The enormous growth in population meant more criminals and more opportunities to commit a crime. A lot of the new criminals were uneducated and unskilled people who moved from rural areas, although poor immigrants also stole to make ends meet. If you didn't have a job, your main source of income had to be through crime, otherwise, you would starve. Drunkenness was a major factor in violent crime during the Industrial Revolution. It was normal for lower-class citizens to get drunk on very cheap booze on a daily basis. As a result, arguments quickly got out of hand, which led to violent quarrels that occasionally turned deadly. Also, by spending so much money on booze, these individuals struggled to pay for food and rent, so crime was one of the few options left on the table. It is also a fact that getting away with a criminal offense was a lot easier than today. For instance, the first fingerprint identification wasn't made until 1892. In fact, there was no real police force in the UK until the creation of the Metropolitan Police by Sir Robert Peel in 1829. Even then, the standard of officer was poor, and only 600 of the original 2,800 kept their jobs. In the United States, the police were more inclined to victimize the working class than serve and protect. This approach led to riots in Chicago on 4 occasions from 1867 to 1894. The standard of justice wasn't much better. The lack of sophisticated policing and investigation methods meant that not only did criminals escape, but innocent people were also often punished. Overall, we have a lot to be grateful for in the 21st century, because life in the 19th century sucked, and this is a fact even before you take slavery into account.